My name is Stephen Fedley and my matrix number is 106447. So this is our introduction for our research proposal and this is our background of study. So for gross fixed capital formation investment in Malaysia, investment has supported industrial expansion, technological upgrading and productivity improvements. However, fluctuation in foreign direct investment, which is FDI, and domestic investment due to global uncertainty raise concerns about sustainability. For example, like period of declining investment often coincide with slower GDP growth, highlighting the need to understand how stable and resilient capital formation is in driving Malaysia economy. So next is about population. A relatively young population provides a potential demographic dividend, but issues such as young youth unemployment, skill mismatch, and an aging population could undermine productivity. So understanding this factor is crucial as demographic change directly affect the supply of labor, human capital development, and ultimately economic growth. And the last thing that we will discuss in this background of study is trade. So, however, increasing global competition, trade volatility, and geopolitical uncertainties pose risks to this model. For instance, reliance on a narrow range of export products make Malaysia vulnerable to price fluctuation and external demand shocks. So, evaluating whether export can continue to sustain growth in the long run is therefore a precise research issue. So this study aligned with Malaysia economic policy priorities, particularly those outlined in the 12th Malaysia Plan and other national development strategies. So by analyzing the roles of investment in capital, population, and export, the research provides insight for policymakers on how to strengthen economic resilience, diversify growth driver, and ensure sustainable development. The findings could inform strategies in investment, promotion, labor market reforms, and trade diversification. So this is our problem statement. In terms of capital investment, Malaysia struggled to maintain stable of FDI inflows to increase economic growth. This occurs because there is low-cost countries such as Vietnam or Indonesia or a big country that are able to produce a lot of goods and services with low production costs. So in terms of population, Malaysia experiencing population aging and declining fertility rate. This creates a problem as the labor will less compared to the aging population, which will reduce human capital. This situation also put a pressure on Malaysia economic as Malaysia need to spend more on healthcare system and the pension. So in terms of trades, Malaysia heavy reliance on import input from other countries make the trade balance instability due to exchange rate fluctuation. So depression in Malaysia currency may improve export but also raise import costs, which also create instability. And this will be the relevant issue for our research proposal topic. So in terms of capital investment, Malaysia experience volatility in FDI inflows. This occurs because there is FDI competitiveness from neighbor countries such as Vietnam from China. Apart from that, instability economic situations such as conflict in the Middle East also disrupt FDI flows. So in terms of population, Malaysia now experiences population aging, meaning increasing in the elderly population and fertility declines. This problem become an issue as this reduce labor supply and productivity, which putting fiscal pressure on pension and healthcare. In terms of trade, Malaysia has issue export and import as it depend in exchange rate. Depreciation in Malaysia currency may improve export but also raise import costs, which creating instability. Some of Malaysia company are to rely on import input to produce goods. This is our scope of study. In terms of variables, the study will examine investment indicators such as foreign direct investment, which is FDI, inflows, and gross capital formation, population factors including population growth, fertility rates, and labor force participation, and trade measures such as export, import, and trade openness. These variables are selected because they represent the most significant structural drivers of Malaysia growth trajectory. The study will rely on secondary data from World Bank data. So its limitation also defined by its scope. Although broad national patterns are recorded, sector-specific or household-level consequences might not be fully addressed because the study will concentrate on macroeconomic indicator rather than micro-level company data. Additionally, the study will examine past and present relationship to offer insight into planning and policy rather than attempting to forecast future economic growth. So this will be our research objective. specific objective is to analyzing the impact of gross capital formation to Malaysia, population, export of goods and services on Malaysia economic growth. So our general objective has three objectives, which is to examine the contribution of gross capital formation to Malaysia economic growth, to analyze the impact of population dynamic on Malaysia economic growth, to investigate relationship of export and Malaysia economic growth.
Next, moving to the next part. My name is Reverend Anna Adrian with metric number 103097. On the table to pull together six key empirical studies that we just walked through. On the row one, starting on the top, Halizam and the colleague study Malaysian from 1970 to 2018 using the ARDL bound testing approach. They look at the GDP alongside the FDI, gross capital formations, populations, and trade openness. This is all in one model. Next, Mustafa and Idris on 2021 used a simpler OLS regressions on Malaysia from 1989 to 2018. They found that both FDI and exports had a positive effect on GDP, while inflation had a negative effect. This gives us a clearer and more direct looks at the investment and trade side specifically. On the row 3, Hashim's and a colleague on 2024 focus more heavily on trade, using VECM on Malaysia data from 1980 to 2020. They found that a trade openness was the most dominant factor influencing Malaysia economic growth ahead every other variable they test. This is the most strongest single finding supporting their trade variable. On the demographic side, on the row 4, Bologan and a colleague used ARDL and ECM method over a long period, which is 1970 to 2020. Even after controlling for inflations, FDI, labor force, and unemployment, they still found that the population had a positive long-run relationship with GDP. So the demographic hold up more complex and control model. Moving to the row 5, Travaraj and Chins on 2022 took a different angle, looking specifically on exports, and they using VECM from 1987 to 2017. They found that more diversified export base together with FDI positively contribute to growth. And finally, Sriveya and Afandi on 2020 widened a lens beyond Malaysia to the whole ASEAN regions using nonlinear ARDL approach from 1971 to 2017. They confirmed that symmetric effects trade openness on growth, meaning the relationship holds consistency whether trade is expanding or contracting. This tells us that Malaysia patents isn't an isolated case, it fits the wider religion trends. That's all from me. Thank you.
Moving on to our theoretical and research framework. To understand how Malaysia's economy grows, we can break this down into three main pillars. First, represented by gross capital formation. We base this on the Herod-Doma model, which states that continuous saving and investment are the primary engines for the economic growth. We also look at the Solos 1 and endogenous growth theories, which reminds us that while capital boosts output in the short term, long-term growth requires technological progress and innovation. Second, demographics. Second, population. This is guided by the demographic dividend theory. The core mechanism here is that when our working age population, those aged 15 to 64, expands faster than our dependent population, It increases the labor supply and provides a massive boost to economic prospects. Third, export of goods and services. This relies on the export-led growth hypothesis. Expanding our export increases global demand for domestic goods. This stimulates further investment and forces local firms to innovate to stay competitive internationally. By connecting these three independent variables to gross domestic product, we form the foundation to our study. Next would be empirical model and methodology. To actually measure these relationships, we utilizing a multiple linear regression model. We are using annual secondary data sourced from the World Bank. Specifically, our econometric equation is formulated as GDP is our dependent variable representing Malaysia's economic growth at a given time. We measure this in a constant LCU to eliminate the effects of inflation and capture real input. GCF is our first independent variable, which means gross capital formation. Next will be the population, the second independent variable, and the third will be export of goods and services, the third independent variable. The beta coefficients represent the slope, measuring exactly how much GDP changes when one of our independent variable shifts by a single unit. Finally, the error term, which accounts for any unobserved factor not included in our model.
Moving on to the methodology, this chapter explains the method and procedure used to analyze the factor influencing Malaysia economic growth. Our group primary goal of this study is to investigate how gross capital formation, total population, and the export of goods and services impact the country GDP. To achieve this section outlines the data collection process, describe the variable, and explain the mathematical model and statistical tool used to test the relationship. For our dependent is gross domestic product, where it measures in constant LCU to eliminate inflation effect and capture real output. For our first independent is gross capital formation, where it measures in constant LCU to capture real physical capital investment. And for our second independent is population, which the total resident headcount used as a proxy for demographic dynamic and national labor supply. And for our third independent is goods and service export, where it measures in constant LCU to access strength, reliance, and world market export volatility.
My name is Bastian Astandi, batch number 107364. Next, I will explain the variable used in these studies. The dependence variable is gross domestic products or GDP, which represent Malaysia economic growth. These three independent variables, which is the first is the gross capital formation, which represent investment activities. The second is population, which represent demographic factors and labor supplies. The third is export of goods and services, which represent Malaysian trade activities. GDP, gross capital formation, and export are measured in constant local currency units, while population is measured by the total population of Malaysia. To analyze the data, this study used four techniques. First, descriptive statistics to summarize the data, and the second, correlation analysis to examine the relationship between the variables. The third one is multiple regression analysis to determine the impact of investment, population, and export on Malaysia economic growth. And finally, t-test and f-test, the use to test whether the results are statistically significant. This technique help us understand which factors significantly influence Malaysia economic growth. That's all from me. Thank Thank you.
So this is our expected contribution from our research proposal that we do. So from perspective of academic, this research added new literature review by study these three variables that contributing economic growth, while the past study highlight the role of these three variables on economic growth. So in terms of policy, the government must formulate strategies to control the effects of an aging population, diversify trade structures, and draw in sustainable foreign direct investment can be guided by insight into trade dependency, population shift, and investment volatility. So in terms of practical, business may make well-informed decisions regarding resource allocation, labor planning, and market expansion by knowing how trade openness, um, population change, and investment flows interact with economic growth.